For weeks now, schools have been empty of all but the children of key workers and the country's most vulnerable kids. And as we've been reporting on Newsnight, only a tiny proportion of them are taking up places, between around 5 and more recently 10% in England. For many education professionals, that is a major focus right now. What is happening to their most at-risk students now that schools are no longer performing their vital oversight role in their lives? What's going on in their homes, and how can staff support them? But there is another broader issue directly affecting some of the country's most disadvantaged children. Put simply, what will this enforced period out of school mean for them, for their futures in terms of educational attainment? Jo Dibb is executive head of 4 schools, 2 primary, 2 secondary, in a deprived part of North London.
That deprivation is just going to grow during this time. We know it's there already, and this can only make things much worse. It's not the same for everybody, and we're not all in the same boat. And if I'm a child from a home where there are many siblings and where we don't necessarily have broadband connection and we don't have multiple devices, so lots of my siblings may be wanting to use the one tablet at the same time, I am not going to have the same chance to access the resources that have been prepared by school.
Now Newsnight can reveal one of the findings of as yet unpublished analysis of that impact. According to the Education Endowment Foundation charity, school closures will result in the socio-economic gap for attainment at least reversing the gains of the last 10 years, perhaps significantly further.
The gap has closed over the 10-year period by around 10 percentage points. Unfortunately, our initial analysis suggests that that gap will be at least entirely reversed.
And when you say at least reversed, what do you mean? We obviously don't know how long this is going to go on for. Can you quantify in any way what each day does?
That's exactly right. We don't know, because we don't know how long schools are going to stay closed, or indeed, if they open partially, what the impact will be. But we do know that the results are going to be very severely consequential for that gap for social disadvantage.
According to the Sutton Trust, while 30% of pupils from middle-class families are taking part in online lessons every day, only 16% of working-class students are. In private secondary schools, the number is far higher. When it comes to work handed in, 50% of teachers in private schools say they are getting work back, compared with 27% in the most advantaged state schools and just 8% in the least. And in some of the most deprived schools, 15% of teachers said more than 33% of their pupils would not have adequate access to electronic equipment to learn from home. This was in contrast to 2% in the most affluent schools. In normal times, schools are engines of social mobility. Closing their doors goes against everything they stand for. And while every child benefits from being in a room with a teacher, for the most disadvantaged, it can be all they have. The former head of Ofsted says that makes it vital that when they do return, school opening hours will need to change dramatically.
The government's going to have to get into negotiation with the teacher professional associations to look at this, to say we missed a huge amount of school. There are going to be adverse consequences to this, particularly for disadvantaged children. We're considering bringing in schools over weekend periods, holiday periods, or extending the school day. That means staff will have to be paid to come in during those periods. If we do that, can you make a commitment to ensure that staff do come in and that children do come in as well? If that doesn't happen, then I can see no alternative but to repeat a year for some of our children. That will have huge logistical difficulties and progression problems to university and so on.
We still don't know when schools will open again. But when they do, it's clear they won't be the same for staff, parents, or the children walking through these gates.
That was Katie Razzall. Well, we're joined now by the former Education Secretary, Justine Greening, the head of Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, and the head teacher of the Michaela School, Katharine Birbalsingh. Katharine, I'm going to start with you on the ground, as it were. Are you in touch at the moment with kids from your school? How much contact are you able to have?
Yeah, well, at our school, every week, the children get a phone call from one of the teachers, and that's to help ensure that they stay on task and they do the work that we've set for them. We have some Zoom lessons and we have some video lessons, but that phone call is really crucial, in particular for the most disadvantaged children, to inspire them to keep working during this time.
You feel, you can say with certainty, you know where every kid is?
Yes, I can say that. I can also say with certainty that not all of them are doing the work they should be doing.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you feel that they are responding to the services? I mean, it's so much about motivation, not just of the kid, but of the family, of the environment that they're in.
That's it.
Are they responding to the work you're setting?
That's it. So it depends, if they're in a family that is proactive and is able to support them at home with the work, then they are going to produce lots and lots. And there's some children who are working hours and hours every day. And then there are other children who aren't producing much work. And that is because of the home life. And one important thing to say is that people assume that it's because they don't have access to tablets. What we find is that actually it's because they have so much access to a tablet or a phone that they spend their time on Snapchat and Instagram. And so on the one hand, they need the tablet or the phone to be able to access the lessons and the online learning that we're providing. On the other hand, it's that device that is actually destroying their ability to do the work, because Snapchat and Instagram obviously have a far greater pull than, your GCSE history lesson.
Can I ask you, fundamentally, are you confident that you can make up for what they're missing this term? Will that be gained back ground?
No, it will not. It is a great concern, obviously, for the most disadvantaged children that they will fall behind. Having said that, I do believe that if we were to go back, say, after May half term, it isn't an enormous amount of time. It isn't a complete disaster. And you get them working when they come back. Obviously, it depends on getting them working when they come back and sliding back into things. And one of the concerns is that they've fallen out of the habit of being in school and doing that regular homework and so on. It might be a bit difficult to get them back on track. But it really does just depend on when we go back. But I share the concerns about the most disadvantaged, because they will be at home, sadly not doing very much in terms of their schoolwork.
Justine, the Educational Trust, as you heard in that piece by Katie, told Newsnight this gap could wipe out a decade of progress at closing the socio-economic gap between rich and poor kids. Does that sound likely to you?
I think it's inevitable that what's happening will take us backwards on access to opportunity. There's already an opportunity gap between young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and those from more advantaged backgrounds. Coronavirus makes that even wider. Of course, we've got a government that said it wants to focus on levelling up, and this now has to be centre stage for Boris Johnson as he looks forward, because otherwise this generation of young people will be the ones that really pay the long-term legacy for the coronavirus crisis that we're in right now, and we can't let that happen.
So does it? I mean, is this government going to prioritise education? We're talking about possibly the biggest economic crisis in living memory. We're talking about Brexit come December. We're talking about a possible 7th wave of pandemic. Can you honestly say, hand on heart, education's not going to get lost in this?
It absolutely has to be at the core, but if you're going to level up Britain, it's got to go wider than just looking at education. There's a role for business to play as well. Smart business leaders are not just looking at what they can do to help on the coronavirus crisis, they're also looking beyond the crisis to see what they can do to help close this opportunity gap.
So practically, break that down for me then. We don't know when schools are going to go back. There's a lot of speculation about the first week of June, but what does the government actually have to practically do to stop this being a lasting legacy on these kids' futures?
Well, in the immediate short term, it needs to look, as Michael Wilshaw suggested, as a catch-up plan, and it needs to talk with
Saturday school, weekend school.
Potentially, it should be talking with teachers and unions about how best to do this. Teachers have worked their socks off during this crisis to try and stay in touch with children It really matters. Parents themselves have done their level best, but clearly there needs to be a more structured plan to look at how we can help those young people catch up. Beyond that, we need to look into our university system and the apprenticeships. There'll be generations of young people who are certainly coming out of those education systems who aren't going to be confronted with the job opportunities they'd hoped for. There'll be young people looking at going to university for whom part-time work was how they were planning to fund some of their accommodation and the wider costs of being at university. That will have now gone. So this will have a profound impact.
School fees, university tuition fees have to go now, don't they?
Well, a lot of students will feel like they've missed 2 terms this year already, partly down to the strikes at the beginning of the year, now down to coronavirus. They're confronted with a following term in the autumn now that will be online. This is not what they paid for. I think possibly one of the most...
something more fundamentally, do you think, given that we're now looking at furloughing of businesses and staff, employees essentially being paid by the state, should we say, university education has to be free again? Is that where you take this?
I certainly think that the issue of maintenance grants is one that the government could quickly look at. But the more fundamental issue is Britain isn't going to get back on its feet if we continue to be a country where roughly 1/3 of people and their children have access to good opportunities, but 2/3 find they're locked out of opportunity, and this country is still a country that's more about connections more than competence.
And Amanda, if I can go to you, Amanda Spielman, what can Ofsted actually do now? Because I guess we just don't know how schools are being rated. We don't know how many kids are being involved, because you're not able to act as the check and balance, are you?
No, that's right. That we are deeply involved in the emergency support work that's going on, coordinated by various parts of central and local government. So we're pretty active at the moment, though in a very different way from usual. But this point is really important, that so many children are affected, and it's not just the poorest. It's the ones with little English. It's the academic. It's the children with special educational needs, the young ones who can't read and write yet, and of course across the board the less motivated children. I think, as Katharine Birbalsingh pointed out, not all children are equally motivated, and from some it's very, very hard to get them to take advantage of the fantastic resources and lessons that are often on offer.
So what is your... Can you enforce anything? Can you enforce in any way who's attending, who's studying, or which schools are providing adequate material?
No, at this stage, it's realistically not feasible to enforce. We are reliant on the goodwill of the teaching profession to a considerable extent at the moment. And a lot of teachers are stepping up and doing a fantastic job in a lot of schools. And there are also interesting national initiatives like the BBC's own curriculum initiative and the Oak National Academy. And there's a scheme to get devices into the hands of the poorest children. There's a phenomenal amount of work going on. But my fear is that despite all this effort, we will end up with a large proportion of children not making very much education progress, if any. And as your other interviewers have pointed out, gaps widening substantially. And that's going to be a huge hill to climb when schools do go back.
To narrow that gap, I mean, your predecessor was suggesting holiday school or weekend school, catch-up school, possibly even repeating a year. How do you think you get children back to normal? I mean, would Ofsted recommend, would you test what they have lost, because you won't know until you do that? Or would you say normalcy is the only thing that matters?
Well, normalcy is the number one thing. And most children are pretty resilient and will over time bounce back and get to where they need to be. We needn't think about this as a crisis for every single child, but we do need to make sure that children as quickly as possible are back in the kind of structure and routine that give them what they need to make really strong educational progress. Good curriculum and good teaching. And that's actually true of all children, including the most disadvantaged. And then, of course, schools have established mechanisms for layering in the extra help and support for the children who need it most. And they're going to need to get to work really fast on that. So I think the message I would give, in some respects, is about keeping it as simple as possible, not layering on too many additional complexities for schools because they're going to have a lot to deal with already. It seems likely that school return will have to be staggered, for example, because of social distancing expectations, and nobody yet knows quite how that will translate in a school context, especially with younger children. So we really need to make sure that we don't make schools' jobs impossibly complicated. They've got to have a clear brief and they've got to have the space in which to do what they do well.
Katharine, briefly, would you be up for Saturday school? Would you?
Yeah. You know what? Teachers across the nation right now, they're amazing. You know, they're doing all these online lessons, Zooming, things that they didn't know anything about, and they've all got to it and figured it out, and they're doing an extraordinary job. And there will be teachers who want to do these Saturday lessons in the holiday time, but we must remember that if the children who are not doing the work at the moment because of lack of family support, lack of an environment that encourages, that kind of has a respect for education, are they really going to come in on the Saturdays? I suspect the teachers will be there teaching themselves. That's the problem. Now, perhaps for younger children, that makes sense. I know with us at secondary school, for the children who are sending in pretend emails from their parents that are not from their parents, but to explain why they weren't in the Zoom lesson, or for the children who have cut a picture out and put it on the Zoom so that it looks like they're in the lesson, but they're not there. Are they really going to come in on a Saturday morning to do extra work? It's just more complicated, and I'm not sure I know what the solution is. But it's not as easy as saying, oh, what we need to do is provide everybody with a tablet and get them in on Saturdays and we'll fix it. It's far more complex because children are complex human beings.
Yeah, you paint a good picture. Thank you all three very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.